positively. Some 6 months then following its enactment, the words Building Safety Act and success have rarely been used in the same sentence. The criticism is perhaps justified. The Act is only partially in force, with no definite timescale for its full implementation. There are extensive provisions, some of which are in force, which remain to be developed and finalised through further legislation, which has yet to be drafted. This means that for the legal sector, let alone for builders and others in the industry, it's simply not possible to conclusively determine the scope and seriousness of the risks presented by the Act. In the next 15 minutes, my aim is to highlight the key issues which arise under the Act, with which the majority of FMB members will need to be concerned, and to share some brief thoughts as to how members can begin to plan for success in the new regulatory landscape. The Act introduces extensive and wide-ranging changes to the regulation of the construction sector. It is, of course, as Brian mentioned, a response to the cladding and fire safety issues which are prevalent in the property sector and which have long needed to be resolved. Consequently, there is an emphasis in the Act on fire safety and higher risk buildings, which currently are defined as buildings over 18 metres in height and containing at least 7 stories. Depending on the part of the Act which is applicable, that definition may be further limited to those properties including 2 or more dwellings, care homes and hospitals. That definition is expected to change, and further legislation is currently under consultation, which will likely mean that the height threshold is reduced. The emphasis, though, on fire safety and higher risk buildings means that there's a common misconception that the Act will only impact on those who are involved in the design, construction and ownership of higher risk buildings or the carrying out of cladding works. In fact, the Act will impact on anyone who has employed, is employing or will employ others to carry out building works to commercial or residential property, be that new build, redevelopment or refurbishment. It will impact building contractors and tradespeople, whether sole traders, SMEs or PLCs, construction professionals such as architects and surveyors, construction product manufacturers and suppliers, as well as the owners and occupiers of these higher risk buildings. This means that if you are in any way involved in the construction sector, you need to understand how the Act impacts you now and how it may impact you in future. For the purposes of this brief talk, I've selected 5 of the key provisions within the Act which are likely to impact on FMB members. Firstly, the Act has introduced a Building Safety Regulator, a division of HSE which will oversee the performance and safety of all buildings. The regulator will act as the building control authority for higher risk buildings. Meanwhile, building authority, building control approvers, which we formerly known as approved inspectors, will continue to carry out building control functions in relation to all other property. The regulator, however, will have extensive enforcement powers to prosecute non-compliance with the building regs. The time limit for levying fines for non-compliance has been removed. The time limit for the giving of a notice to a property owner to alter or remove non-compliant work has been increased from 1 year to 10 years. During the carrying out of works, the regulator can give notices requiring non-compliant work to be remedied by a certain date, and to stop all work on site until the non-compliance is resolved. A failure to comply with those notices is a criminal offence, which could result in imprisonment or an unlimited fine. If the offence is committed by a company, then in certain circumstances, the Act allows the personal prosecution of directors, managers, and similar officers of the company, or, as the case may be, limited liability partnership. The risk of personal prosecution for these and other offences under the Act means builders and directors and managers of building companies need to exercise a greater personal oversight for the carrying out and management of works to ensure not only compliance with the building regs, but also with any notices that may be issued by the regulator from time to time. The Act also includes provisions to bring Section 38 of the Building Act 1984 into force. It is not currently in force, despite having existed within this piece of legislation since it was originally enacted. And it is unclear when, or even if, it will be brought into force. In principle, though, Section 38 will give private persons the right to claim a financial remedy from builders, construction professionals, and tradespeople, where work to any building, whether commercial or residential, is non-compliant with the building regs. Currently, a claim could be brought under any corresponding contract for the works if the contract includes an actual or inferred requirement that the work comply with the building regs. Unlike a contractual claim, however, Section 38 will apply to any works carried out which are required to comply with the building regs, irrespective of the contract terms that may exist between the parties involved, and irrespective of the type of work which is being carried out. Quite simply, if there is non-compliance with the building regulations, there will be a claim. It will be no defence to rely on an issue with the specification of the works. It will be no defence even to rely on the fact that the works might have been inspected and signed off by the building control approver. The scope of Section 38 does not limit the nature of the financial remedy which can be sought, and so it will not be limited to simply the cost of remedy. It could extend beyond that to other, we say, consequential losses which may have been suffered by the employer or property owner. Most worryingly, perhaps, a claim under Section 38 will be able to be brought within 15 years of completion of the non-compliant work. This will, though, operate only prospectively, meaning that it will only apply to works which are completed after a section is brought into force. We expect it is a question of when, not if, Section 38 is brought into force, which means there is a greater need than ever for members to implement reliable systems for not only ensuring but also evidencing compliance with the building regulations. The ease of obtaining photo and video records during the life cycle of the project means there's no excuse for not collating and maintaining a catalogue of evidence. It may, after all, be required up to 15 years post-completion. Previously, the Defective Premises Act of 1972 was only relevant where work was carried out in relation to the provision of a dwelling, which meant the construction or conversion of a property so as to form a new dwelling. The Act has removed this limitation and imposes a new duty under the 1972 Act on anyone carrying out work in relation to a dwelling to ensure that the work is carried out in a workmanlike or professional manner, using proper materials, and so as to ensure that the dwelling is fit for habitation. This duty is imposed on all builders, construction professionals, and tradespeople, regardless of the contractual terms between the parties, and regardless of the nature or scale of the work which is being carried out. Liability will, though, only arise if there is a breach of the duty and the dwelling is rendered uninhabitable as a result of that breach. Again, the nature and scope of the financial remedy which can be sought is not limited solely to the cost of remedy, and so could extend to any further losses which the complaining party may suffer, commonly the cost of obtaining alternative accommodation. A claim under the new provision which the Building Safety Act has introduced can only be brought if the breach of duty occurred post April 22. And any claim, again, can be brought within 15 years. More concerningly, the Building Safety Act retrospectively extends the period for bringing claims for breaches of duty which occurred pre-April 22 in relation to, as I said a moment ago, the original duty which was owed in relation to construction or conversion so as to form new dwellings. That period is now 30 years, meaning that if a member carried out works in respect of which there was a breach of duty, rendering a property uninhabitable in November 1992, that breach of duty is still actionable today. Similarly, if a member carried out works to a dwelling in respect of which there was a breach of duty in March of this year, 2022, that breach will remain actionable in 2052. There is a need, therefore, for not only members but construction professionals and tradespeople generally to carry out a review now of current and historic properties involving works to dwellings, to identify those projects which in principle could be subject to a claim under the Defective Premises Act, and to collate and securely store for the long term any documentation or evidence relevant to the carrying out of the works. It may not be required now, but it may be required in 15 or even 30 years' time. Although new home warranties have been available in different forms for years, it is now a legislative requirement under the Act that the purchasers of new build homes be provided with a 15-year warranty to be in a prescribed form. The detail will be set out in secondary further legislation, and the Act makes provision for the imposition of financial penalties in the event of non-compliance. The Act also introduced the New Homes Ombudsman, which will administer the New Homes Ombudsman scheme, including a dispute resolution service to enable new homeowners to seek redress from builders and developers without having to have recourse to legal proceedings. It is also expected that the Act will make it a legal requirement to register for the New Homes Quality Code of Practice, which is currently voluntary, with the Ombudsman having investigatory and enforcement powers to police compliance with the code. The Ombudsman scheme will not only apply to PLC house builders, it will apply to anyone carrying out a new build development of any scale, whether it be one property or 100 properties. For members who are involved in carrying out own new home developments, it will be necessary to ensure prompt registration with the scheme as soon as registration is available, and to ensure a thorough understanding of its operation to include the requirements of the Code of Practice. A common response from builders and developers to the potentially extensive and long-term risks presented by the Act has been to suggest that there may be an increase in the use of single-purpose companies for the carrying out of individual projects, so as to insulate the liabilities which may arise in relation to that project within the protection of limited liability afforded by that company. To address this, the Act introduces the Building Liability Order, which will enable certain liabilities of companies and LLPs to be recoverable from other associated companies and LLPs. In certain circumstances, it will no longer be possible to insulate liabilities. The scope of the Building Liability Order, though, is limited. It can only be sought in relation to liabilities arising under Section 38 of the Building Act 1984, which, as I mentioned a moment ago, is not yet in force. In relation to liabilities arising under the Defective Premises Act 1972, which, as I mentioned a moment ago, requires a breach of duty in relation to works carried out to a dwelling, which renders the dwelling uninhabitable. Or in relation to liabilities arising from a building safety risk, which is defined as a risk to the safety of people in or about a building arising from the spread of fire or structural failure. There's no further guidance as to what that means or as to the circumstances in which a building safety risk may arise. Additionally, a building liability order can only be granted by the court where the court believes it is just and equitable to do so. Again, there's no definition of the term just and equitable, nor any guidance as to those circumstances in which the court will be satisfied a building liability order should be granted. We suspect the court will approach the issue on a case-by-case basis, meaning it will be some time, years, until we have any clarity as to the circumstances in which the court will be willing to grant these building liability orders. Although the scope of liabilities in respect of which a building liability order can be sought is limited, the relevant provisions have retrospective effect and will operate irrespective of the current status of the company which incurred the liability. It may be in liquidation. It may be dissolved. It doesn't matter. If a liability arising in one of those three circumstances has been left unsatisfied by that company, in principle, a building liability order can be sought now in order to recover that liability from an associated company today. Putting that in the context of the provisions I mentioned regarding the Defective Premises Act, that means a member who carried out works 30 years ago through a company which is long insolvent and long dissolved, but which has or will incur a liability under the Act, could see a building liability order being used to recover that liability from any associated successor company which the member is using today. The Act, then, primarily presents an immediate risk in the short term to members who are predominantly involved in the carrying out of works to residential property. In the medium term, however, all members will be exposed to the risk of liability under the Act, particularly when carrying out works to which the building regs apply. In many instances, the risk is not only in relation to current and future projects, but in relation to legacy projects, in respect of which any liabilities were long believed to have been insulated. The immediate steps, then, which it may be wise for all members to take at this stage, will include carrying out a review of all current and historic projects. For historic projects, and as a matter of ongoing best practice, to collate and securely store for the long term any documentation and evidence relevant to the carrying out of the building works, particularly to the extent that it's possible to demonstrate compliance with the building regs in place at the time the works were carried out. For current and future projects, implementing a system to accurately and comprehensively ensure and evidence compliance with the building regs. For sole traders and directors and managers of building companies and LLPs, to exercise increased personal oversight of the carrying out and management of construction works, to ensure, for example, compliance with the building regs and any notices which may be issued by the regulator from time to time. And more importantly now than ever, to pay attention when negotiating contract terms, because employers will undoubtedly seek guarantees and warranties to pass on the liabilities which may arise under the Act in relation to any given project. As to future risk management, much will depend on the final form of the regulation introduced by the Act as it develops over the coming months and more likely years. More than ever, there is a need for members to keep up to date with regulatory knowledge and training, and of course there's no easier way to do that than being a member of the FMB. I hope you found my brief talk useful. If you are interested in learning any more of the detail of any of the provisions that I've referenced, then please join me in the FMB for a webinar on 24th November at 4:30. All of the details of which are on the website.
Thank you very much. I think time dictates that we have to forego questions with you. Thank you so much for that. Very detailed, very